In an era of cynicism and cancel culture, how can our local churches provide hope and healing for those who've experienced emotional and spiritual abuse? In this episode, I'm joined by Chuck DeGroat, a licensed therapist and spiritual director who serves as professor of counseling and Christian spirituality at Western Theological Seminary. Chuck has written a number of books, including When Narcissism Comes to Church. Together, Chuck and I begin by looking at how narcissism in churches and church leaders has been addressed in recent history, especially the past few years. Then, we explore how the local church can minister to survivors of emotional and spiritual abuse. Are you ready? Let's go. Hello, friends, and welcome to another insightful episode of FrontStage, BackStage. I'm your host, Jason Daye, and it's my honor, my privilege, really, to have the opportunity to sit down each and every week and dive into a conversation with a trusted ministry leader. We do this all to help you and pastors and ministry leaders just like you embrace a healthy, sustainable rhythm for both life and ministry. We are proud to be a part of the Pastor Serve Network. And each week, we don't only have a conversation like this, but our team also creates an entire toolkit, a resource to help you and your ministry team at your local church dig more deeply into the topic that we discuss. And you can find that at pastorserve.org/network. There you'll find lots of different resources, including a ministry leader's growth guide with questions for reflection that you and your team can go through. And again, really just kind of dive more deeply into the topic. So be sure to check that out at pastorserve.org/network. And then also, we'd love to bless pastors and ministry leaders here at Pastor Serve. And our coaches are offering a complimentary coaching session to any pastor or ministry leader. You can find more details at pastorserve.org/free session. So be sure to avail yourself of that opportunity as well. Now, if you're joining us on YouTube, please give us a thumbs up. And in the comments below, drop your name and the name of your church. We'd love the opportunity to get to know our audience better, and our team will be praying for you and for your ministry. Whether you're following us on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform, please take a moment just to subscribe or to follow us so you do not miss out on these great conversations. As I said, I'm excited about today's conversation. At this time, I would like to welcome Chuck DeGroat. Chuck, welcome to Front Stage, Backstage.
Really good to be with you, Jason.
Yeah, man, it's so good to talk with you again. I guess it was about 3 years ago now, almost, you released a new book entitled When Narcissism Comes to Church. And even in the midst of a global pandemic unfolding, Chuck, when that released, man, that book was widely read. It helped launch a ton of conversations, a lot of discussion about narcissistic leaders, about emotional and spiritual abuse in the church, really a gift to the church in so many ways. And you and I had a great conversation when it first released. But needless to say, as we all know, a lot has happened in the past 3 years. And I want to get to what you've really witnessed since the book has released. But before we get there, first, for those who may not be familiar with this book, can you give us a snapshot of really, Chuck, how did this book come about and what does it touch upon?
Yeah. Well, it's good to be back. It's never fun to have this conversation. I should say that at the outset. I mean, I've written some other things, and sometimes I want to say, let's talk about wholeheartedness or let's talk about you. But this has been a conversation that we've needed to have over the last number of years. And for me, it began way back in the late 1990s when I was in seminary in the midst of my own arrogance, my own pride, being called out by a seminary counseling professor, and then being invited to do a clinical mental health counselor program. And so I got trained as a therapist, and then I started doing the work as a pastor and as a therapist. And I was seeing this. I was seeing this in my church as I got involved with church planting. I was seeing these dynamics in church planters in particular. Oftentimes, I was the one doing sort of the psychological assessment side of things, and so it was my job to raise the flag. And then about 5 or 6 years ago now, I was challenged by a couple of pastor colleague friends to write something on this, and so that's the book really emerged out of that. But I have to say, I didn't know this, and others didn't know this at the time. But in that same year, Wade Mullen wrote a book, Diane Langberg wrote a book, Scott McKnight and Laura Barringer wrote a book, and so clearly there was something going on. There was something in the air, and we all sort of offered our unique perspectives and contributions to this larger conversation.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now talk to us a little bit about when narcissism comes to church. What what are you addressing in this book?
Yeah. Well, so I wanted to address the dynamic of narcissism. I wanted to provide some clarity to churches, to leaders, to pastors, to lay people about what exactly this is, because I was seeing it pop up. That person's a narcissist, and I happen to think, and this is one of the things I was hopeful for, that that's irresponsible at some level to simply use that language in a way that isn't sort of founded in a clinical and even a trauma informed understanding of narcissism. And so I wanted to help people understand narcissism, but also to broaden the typical sort of psychological understanding of narcissism, to show the sort of many faces or facets of narcissism. It doesn't always just look grandiose and entitled. Uh, I wanted to talk about the pastoral face of narcissism and the ecclesial face of narcissism. What does it look like in pastors? But what does it also look like in church systems, where it might not be the pastoral leader, but it might be the system that the pastor finds himself or herself in? And so, and then I wanted to anchor it in sort of a biblical understanding of power and humility, in and through Philippians chapter 2, that Jesus, being the very nature of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped or exploited, right? That and that we grasp and exploit power all the time, you know. And so
Right.
Jesus sort of paints this different kind of picture of the way of the cross, the way of leadership, that I think we can learn from. And so that's just a small snapshot of what the book tries to do.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chuck, and really encourage if you haven't read the book yet, really encourage our audience to pick it up and read it. Now, one of the things that we kind of wrestle with in the church world is that the role of a pastor can sometimes, and you've written about this extensively, almost be a magnet
Yeah.
for narcissistic personalities. Can you talk to us a bit about that?
Yeah, what's interesting about that is that I think narcissism can evolve, and so it's not like, you can take some sort of test in seminary and that would tell that you're not a narcissist, something like that, right? I mean, I've done a lot of work in and through not just pastoral ministry, but seminary education over the years, and I've worked with men in particular where we'll talk about these kinds of things, but then I'll start to see over 5 or 10 years, a platform grow, influence grow. I'll if I keep in touch, I'll sort of start to notice some dynamics of them becoming more isolated, self-protective. Um, and so, in that sense, I think it's really important to recognize that as you get into ministry and as you're elevated into positions of authority and power, as you experience the anxiety of authority and power, because it only grows. Some of us think that if I climb the ladder, I won't feel as anxious as I do when I'm making less money or I'm kind of down here on the kind of pendulum. But like I think that as you climb the ladder, anxiety grows, and with that, you become more self-protective, and so and insulated, and you're more apt in situations like that to bully out of your own anxiety. And so some of it is just being aware of how that dynamic plays out in a leader as he or she climbs the ladder or grows into positions of leadership or authority.
Yeah. Now, Chuck, it seems that um, a pastor or a ministry leader is not necessarily going to self-identify, raise their hand, and say, "Yeah, I'm a narcissist," right? So that's kind of the challenge in this, right? It's one of those things where it may exist, but in order for there to be some self-awareness about it, that tends to be a huge challenge. So, are
Yeah.
there things, and as you just said, this could be these tendencies, narcissistic
uh,
tendencies, can evolve over time.
yeah.
So how Chuck, how can a pastor, a ministry leader, um, kind of step back and enter into a way of identifying if there are these tendencies or if these tendencies are growing?
Yeah. Well, it begins with a curiosity, that that is just native to the person. I mean, I've had a lot of pastors reach out since the book came out. I'll get DMs on Twitter. Hey, I want to know, is there something I could do? Is there a way of self understanding that would help me identify narcissism in me? And so it begins with that kind of curiosity, which is accompanied by some humility. I mean, just to ask that question is, I think, really important in the first place. Then after that, it doesn't end there. I think there are ways of going about teasing this out. I do some more. I'm a therapist, and I'll do individual sort of hourly work, weekly work, but I'll also do these kinds of 5-day intensives with pastors where I'll ask them for feedback from 6, 7, 8 staff members. Or in some cases, we'll do interviews with those 6, 7, 8 staff members, and we'll get feedback and we'll ask specific questions to understand how this pastor relates. And that's where it gets a little bit more challenging and personal, and it raises the anxiety level for a pastor, right? Because it's one thing to DM someone and to ask, "Am I a narcissist? Do you see
Mhm.
some signs of it on Twitter?" It's another thing to say, how does this look as I'm leading my staff? What does it look like on Sunday morning? How do I impact people? What are my blind spots? And that requires a process. And as I say, it's more anxiety producing and challenging.
Yeah, that's helpful, Chuck. Now, a lot of the, um, how should I say this? A lot of the narcissistic church leaders that people are kind of familiar with are those who have pastored larger churches,
Mm.
led larger ministry organizations, because those are ones that make the headlines.
Yeah.
But but narcissism, it can occur in a small kind of family church just
Yeah.
as easily as a mega church, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And this is where it's important to tease out the different faces of narcissism. And so you'll see it in that grandiose narcissist, right? That loves the big stage, needs the audience. But there's also a kind of flip side of that, and then many iterations of it in between. But the flip side might look like the pastor in a very small church who says, "We're we're the only church that really honors the word of God. We're the only church that stands in truth. We're the only church willing to take a stand against this and that and the other thing. And we are, proud 30 people at blankety blank Presbyterian church or Methodist church or non-denominational church are the true church."
Mm.
And that too is a form of narcissism. It might not occur on a big stage. Um, but it also, that particular form of narcissism comes with a kind of martyr complex, I find sometimes too. Like, we're small because people don't get us and they don't understand that we are standing in the truth. And so again, that and so many different iterations of it in between that, and that's where it's important not to just sort of get limited to our cultural understanding of narcissism, which is like big ego, big personality, inspiring figure, demands attention. There's more to it than that.
Yeah, that's helpful, Chuck. Now, as I said, you released this book 3 years ago. And as you said, a lot was going on at that time. In that same year, several other
Yeah.
books kind of revolving around similar topics were released, great books as well.
Yeah.
Um, the past 3 years, a lot has happened. What have you seen? What have you witnessed
Yeah.
since releasing the book to where we sit today in the church world around this topic?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this is understandable, but not merely, as I said, because of my book, but a number of other books and a conversation that had started before this too, with Me Too and Church Too, podcasts that have come out talking about these kinds of dynamics. People are feeling more free to name these realities, and what happens in times like this is you see it in other kinds of conversations as well, as people start telling their stories with more freedom. You'll see it if you follow particular kinds of social media threads where these realities are being named more honestly. And uh, and I think if you talk to denominational leaders or network leaders, they're feeling the heat too. been a rise in investigations, accusations, and investigations because people are talking about this a bit more freely. There's more anxiety in churches and among leaders. I mean, I've talked to a number of leaders, a lot of leaders who look like me, by the way, white male, middle aged leaders who are anxious about this moment. What if someone accuses me of something, right? Um, I do think that there is this kind of pendulum swing sometimes where we didn't talk about it at all, and pastors were getting away, churches were getting away, not just merely pastors, churches were getting away with things for a long, long time, and we swung to the other side where uh, just a lot of pain, and I've sort of called it like wartime triage is going on, where a lot of us who do this work and talk to one another see the blood and the carnage all around us, right? And we're doing as much as we can, but I can't do any more than I'm doing, and others who are doing like Wade Mullen doing investigations, his time is limited, and Boz Tavigian and others who are involved in this work. So it does feel like a time where there's just a lot of pain, a lot of woundedness, um, a lot of blood spilled, and not enough people to sort of care for the wounded. That's the moment that we're in. Some of us are beginning to think about, but what about the next 10 years? What about the next 20 years? Like, what needs to happen for us to transition from this sort of moment of triage and great pain, in order to move in positive directions towards systems that are more healthy, processes that are vetted and wise, et cetera.
Yeah, that's good. Now, as you said, we kind of find ourselves in this period right now where there's a greater freedom for survivors of spiritual abuse,
That's right.
to kind of voice, hey, this is what I've experienced, and it's an interesting time, because the Me Too movement, the Church Too movement, um, this conversation being you know, almost permission given in a way to
Mhm.
have this
That's
conversation.
right.
That's where we kind of find ourselves
Yeah.
in. And so in the midst of that, there are lots of different feelings. One is there's obvious heartbreak for those who have endured this sort of abuse, and how do we help come alongside of them and help them through healing. There's also heightened distrust in ways of the church as an institution, right?
Yeah.
Naturally, because the more stories you hear about this, the more people are saying, well, that's not at all Jesus. So,
Mhm.
forget it. And they're kind of jettisoning church
Yeah.
altogether. Um, there's conversation around even, and this is the nuances and the challenge I think we're navigating, because there are conversations around being there for those who have survived abuse like this, but then there are also people who are talking about, well, this feels like a witch hunt,
Yeah.
or just recently in an article I read just this past week, there was a term used, I think, cannibalistic Christians,
Mm.
kind of turning
Yeah.
turning on one another. So there are all these kind of pieces muddled together in the midst of this,
Yeah.
and yet Christ is calling us to healing and wholeness.
Yeah.
So, Chuck,
Yeah.
not that you have all the answers in the world, but how can we as pastors and ministry leaders try to navigate this season that we find ourselves in, where it is kind of like wartime triage,
Yeah.
but it's kind of messy right now, right?
Yeah, it is messy, and it's at some level, it's understandable, that it would be messy, and I mean, I think, I understand, people are frustrated by the critiques, right? This isn't the first time in the history of the church where there's been criticism of clergy, right? There was a
Right.
Protestant Reformation, or read Richard Baxter's The Reformed Pastor. I mean, there, there are historical precedents for these kinds of things. I do think that, there are a number of us who, like me, who was a pastor for a long time, and so I'm not one to sort of sit on the sidelines and to throw bombs, right? In a sense, it's for the sake of, reform, for the sake of restoration, for the sake of greater honesty and transparency around these things. Um, but I do think in the midst of this, I'm wanting to sort of shift the conversation from, uh, I get that we're pointing fingers and we're naming realities, and we're kind of in some ways barely surviving. I want us, I'm doing some writing right now on trauma. I want us to shift to places where we begin to do our own work so that those of us who are survivors of this kind of abuse can get healthy, right? It's
Mm,
um, Gabor Mate, who writes a lot about trauma, says trauma is not what happened to you, but what happens within you in the absence of an empathetic witness. And I think sometimes when we don't shift to this is what's happening within me, and we're just sort of shadow boxing with all the stuff out there that happened to us, we can remain in our pain, and that's not a healthy place to be. And so we need to begin doing our own work. I also think that I've been saying for a number of years now, we need to see the church come through with resources in the same way the church has resourced church planting, for instance, in the last 20 years. Can we begin to see resourcing for training on clergy power and abuse in the church? Resources for mental health so that pastors and people within the church can get care, right? Sabbatical and retreat resources. Uh, Better resourcing around investigations and processes when accusations are made. I'd like to see the elimination of NDAs in churches. Like we're beginning to think, 5, 10 years down the road, what are positive developments that would represent the fruit of this? If this isn't just bomb throwing,
right.
or finger pointing at those really bad pastors, how do we shift systems and denominations into more healthy places?
Yeah, that's great because that's gospel, right? That's Jesus is inviting us into a place of healing and wholeness,
Hmm.
both as individuals and his church, right? He's refining his church, and so it's important for us as ministry leaders to be sensitive to that. Chuck,
Hmm.
I'm curious, um, as people are coming forward, as they're sharing their stories, how can the church, and I guess I'm talking about the local church. How can a local church pastor, how can they help minister to those who've experienced abuse
Yeah.
from a narcissistic pastor, ministry leader, church experience, something like that?
Yeah. Well, so there are a lot of really good churches and there are a lot of really good pastors who care deeply about these things. And what's been encouraging for me to see is exactly what you just said. Pastors stepping in, saying, "I believe you. I hear you. I want to take what you're saying seriously. I want to walk alongside you." Our church is willing to help provide resources to you so that you can get the care and counseling you need. Um, and so, part of it is can pastors and churches create the kind of safety for a victim or a survivor to come in and tell her story or his story? Um, will we believe them and honor their story? I know there's a lot to be teased out. And that's why we have processes and investigations and stuff like that. But will we say, take your story seriously? I believe you. I'm going to walk with you. I'm going to make sure you get the care that you need. I think that that's what we're looking for because for so long, people who experienced abuse within the church had to carry their pain quietly and silently. They had no one to go to, and when they said it out loud, they weren't believed. Their stories weren't honored. And there's a whole history of this, right? And we've seen these major scandals within multiple churches now. We've even seen, I mean, one of my heroes, Jean Vanier, right, the founder of L'Arche Ministries. That now there's a recently released investigative report on Jean Vanier's abuses, right? And so this has been going on for decades, been going on for centuries. Now, can we create the kind of safety and space for people to come and merely be able to tell their stories, be heard, to walk with a good trauma-informed therapist? Can we help provide care in those kinds of ways? And then can we set up really good, healthy processes and not just move to peacemaking quickly, but really good processes that will sort of look at these things carefully, investigate carefully, so that we can come to some sort of resolution, maybe even some sort of restoration. That takes time, that takes resources, money. It's really uncomfortable. And so, but I'm always inviting pastors and churches into that. Let me tell you, after 3 years of sort of talking about this and doing podcasts, there's a lot of good to report.
Mm.
There are a lot of pastors, a lot of churches, denominations that are talking about processes. It's really slow. It's too slow. It's always too slow. But good things are happening.
Yeah, that's good and that's encouraging, Chuck. I guess if we're looking at the local church, those are all great suggestions and
Yeah.
recommendations. I think that's important. But looking at the local church in a very practical way,
Yeah,
a pastor who's watching right now, listening, saying,
yeah.
"Hey, I know there are people that have been wounded
Mhm.
in my church, in my community. Um, what can a local church pastor begin to do in a very practical way
Yeah.
to help bring about some healing?"
Well, I mean, I think part of it right now is it's gotta begin with some education for those local church pastors, right? I think that's where a number of us have written some books on this. There are some really good trainings out there that, if you wanna learn more about spiritual abuse, emotional abuse in the church, there are trainings out of the Allender Center. I know, training I did for, Church for the Sake of Others, that diocese within, the ACNA, that video's up there. Um, there are organizations like Grace, netgrace.org, that have all kinds of really good resources on safeguarding initiatives that can happen within churches, and processes for taking abuse seriously. And so, as a pastor, I would be resourced. I'd learn more about these kinds of things. As a pastor, I would get your own therapy. I'd want to ask every pastor to look at his story or her story and to take seriously what they've experienced in their lives and to grow in health and wholeness themselves. Um, and then, and then to create the kind of culture where we can talk about these kinds of things, and that there is a kind of culture setting that has to happen within churches where um, for instance, pastors are saying these things from the pulpit, right? It doesn't mean that you have to preach on these kinds of things week in and week out, but pastors are saying, these kinds of things happen in churches. I myself go to counseling to look at my own life, look at my own story. We're a church that wants to create space for you if you have experienced pain, if you do have a story that you need to tell, we want to hear it. And it's not just me, maybe the white male pastor in the office. We've got women who are elders or deacons here. We've got leaders who are willing to listen to you. Or if there's something about me, the pastor, here are others who you can talk to. And I want to know because I've got blind spots, like one of the things I said as a pastor going back to the mid 2000s, 2005, 6, I began saying to people who were under me sort of on the org chart, right? People who were down the line, hey, I want to hear how you experience me. So that's another thing that pastors can do is to say to staff, no repercussions. I want to hear how I impact you, how you experience me, how I lead meetings, how we relate, behind the scenes, what it's like for me to for you to come into my office and talk to me. All of those kinds of things can be helpful. And I mean, I'm just sort of scraping the surface now of what pastors and churches can do.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Chuck. I like those ideas, those thoughts. Uh, Chuck, you talked a little bit about that. You've seen some
Mm.
great things happening in the church, some very positive things happening in the church. I was wondering if you could just share some of those things that in this area of trauma, in this area
Yeah.
of healing, that give you hope that you're
Yeah.
witnessing now.
Well, so there will always be pushback to this, and there will always be say that we're cannibalizing or we're critics or um, but there are many, many pastors who have decided to step in and take this seriously. And so, like I just said, there are many pastors who've reached out to me privately to say, "What can I read? How can I learn? What are courses that I can take? Um, and then how do I go about shifting my culture? How do I go about creating a safe culture within my church?" And just even over the last 6 months or so, I've navigated my way to several different websites of pastors who I've had initial conversations with. And I've seen new things on their websites, like safeguarding initiatives on their websites to protect children or to engage processes if there are claims of abuse or something like that. And so those are really important developments right there. I think part of this too is we're normalizing this at some level. We're normalizing getting care for mental health kinds of issues, right? And so more and more we're talking about trauma, pain that we all experience. And I'm seeing pastors go to therapy for the first time. They'll reach out to me and they'll be like, "I finally have a therapist. I've been in ministry for 20 years. Praise God," right? Um, I think part of it too is we're seeing people who have power relinquish power to draw in women or people of color, to elevate people who, so it's one thing for someone like me to talk about this stuff. It's another thing for people like me to say, how can I relinquish power in order to bring others into positions of voice or authority or power within the church? And I'm beginning to see pastors I know make really courageous decisions to do that, and that to me represents like um, putting your money where your mouth is, so to speak. Like that's the real fruit of this when it's not just like a tweet, but it's actually there are things happening behind the scenes. Um, or a woman will say to me, "Hey, I know you know such and such a pastor. I want you to know that when I went to him, he received my story with such graciousness and offered to pay for counseling, and made sure that like people walked with me to the point when I was ready." So there again, that's just scraping the surface, but um, and there are also, I can say, conversations happening that, people don't even know about. Like, behind the scenes, there are people saying, "How can I give resources? How can I, um, be involved with larger conversations about NDAs?" So, there's lots of good stuff happening.
Yeah, I love that. That's very positive and hopeful. Uh, Chuck, as we wind down this conversation, very very helpful conversation. As we wind down, I want to give you the opportunity to share. You talked a little bit about some of your writings that you're working on, but just share some of the things that are coming up. Some things that you're excited about,
Yeah.
kind of moving forward and helping to resource the church, because I know that you've mentioned some programs and those types of
Yeah.
things. So
Yeah, I mean, what I'm working on personally right now is, a couple of things. I mentioned these to you before we started recording, but, I've developed and am developing a clinical mental health counseling program at the seminary where I'm teaching. I think right now we're seeing a shortage in therapists, and we need really good, what I call relationally oriented, trauma-informed therapists rooted in the Christian soul care tradition. There's a lot of really bad training for therapists out there. There are programs that are degree mills, that, treat symptoms and don't treat trauma, and so part of it is, how do we train more practitioners, better practitioners, anchored, what I call hopeful and humble practitioners? And so uh, there are these sort of systemic things that we need to do, right? That are important, just in terms of training and resourcing at a larger level. The writing I'm doing right now is I discerned what was next. I mean, there were some publishers that were like, "Hey, we need a part two of the narcissism book," and I really didn't want to write on narcissism again, but I did want to provide a vision uh, for restoration, recovery, transformation, healing, and wholeness for people who have experienced abuse, um, who have been victimized, who are survivors, who've experienced trauma, and who need to make that shift like I did, after I experienced some pain 20 years ago from a number of years where I was like, "Justice for my," for the person who hurt me, which is understandable, right? I mean, there are processes that we need to engage, in order to sort of get justice. But I had to do the work of shifting to, I'm really hurting, and even though some things have been resolved out here, it's still unresolved within me. So what's the work that I need to do to heal and to become whole? And so that's a second part of this conversation. Like, there's the work of reckoning that's going on out here.
right.
And there can be investigative processes, and there can be accountability and even justice. And that doesn't leave, in my experience. I was leading a retreat last week, with some therapists, and I was hearing this from them and from others who have experienced this kind of pain, where it's like, I got the justice that I demanded, and I'm still in a lot of pain. And so, what do I need to do to heal within me? And some of that is cultivating a vision for the church, of the church, that uh, is a church where people can experience the kind of safety and relationship that they need to become whole. And so for me, it's not, let's burn it all down.
Right.
I mean, I think at times there need to be, I mean, there needs to be some reckoning that's painful, right? But I do think that in the midst of all the dying that's going on, you might say, there is a rising. There is a, I mean, Jesus is a God of resurrection, right? And so in the midst of the dying, there is a kind of there's a beautiful sort of rising, and we're seeing churches say we want to walk alongside people. I just talked to a group of churches up in Traverse City, Michigan, that were like, we want to give money to your counseling programs so that we can have counselors come up here and we can start church-based counseling centers so that no one will ever be without a therapist if they need one. And it will become
Wow.
it will cost, and we'll invest in the health of our people in meaningful ways. And as someone who started 2 church-based counseling centers, that thrills my heart because there's a lot of good work that can be done, within that space. And so, uh, yeah, so again, there are good things to report in the midst of all the hard conversation.
Yeah, I love that, Chuck. I love
Yeah.
that, brother. And for your book, links to your book and your website and the seminary and everything else, we will have all those available to our audience at pastorserve.org/network in the toolkit that goes with this episode. So you guys will have opportunity and the different resources that Chuck mentioned in this conversation. Because I know a lot of you are probably listening to what he's sharing and interested and intrigued, and we'll have those available for you there. So be sure to check that out. Chuck, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you with us. If people want to connect with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, most often it's through my website at chuckdegroat.net. And there's a way that you can connect with me through there. You could find me at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan too.
Excellent, brother.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much again. I appreciate all you are doing for the kingdom. Appreciate your heart for pastors, for ministry leaders, and for brothers and sisters in Christ. So thank you.
Thanks, Jason.
God bless you.
Now, before you go, I want to remind you of an incredible free resource that our team puts together every single week to help you and your team dig more deeply and maximize the conversation that we just had. This is the weekly toolkit that we provide, and we understand that it's one thing to listen or watch an episode, but it's something entirely different to actually take what you've heard, what you've watched, what you've seen, and apply it to your life and to your ministry. You see, FrontStage BackStage is more than just a podcast or YouTube show about ministry leadership. We are a complete resource to help train you and your entire ministry team as you seek to grow and develop in life and ministry. Every single week, we provide a weekly toolkit which has all types of tools in it to help you do just that. Now you can find this at pastorserve.org/network. That's pastorserve.org/network. And there you'll find all of our shows, all of our episodes, and all of our weekly toolkits. Now inside the toolkit are several tools, including video links and audio links for you to share with your team. There are resource links about different resources and tools that were mentioned in the conversation, several other tools, but the greatest thing is the Ministry Leaders Growth Guide. Our team pulls key insights and concepts from every conversation with our amazing guests. And then we also create engaging questions for you and your team to consider and process, providing space for you to reflect on how that episode's topic relates to your unique context at your local church, in your ministry, and in your life. Now, you can use these questions in your regular staff meetings to guide your conversation as you invest in the growth of your ministry leaders. You can find the weekly toolkit at pastorserve.org/network. We encourage you to check out that free resource. Until next time, I'm Jason Daye, encouraging you to love well, live well, and lead well. God bless.